Welcome to Black Hat Briefings, held November 21st through the 22nd, 2001 in Amsterdam. This is videotape number 16, IDS Evasion Design Tricks for Buffer Overflow Exploit.
On to this, the last presentation, the last session of Black Hat Europe. I'm Anders and this is Ian. We're from Stockholm, Sweden, and we're working at a company named IX Security. We're going to present to you a couple of design tricks for writing buffer overflow exploits, and these have a side effect of evading some kind of intrusion detection systems. Okay, so why would anyone be interested in buffer overflows at all? Well, I think there are plenty of reasons for that, and one of them is that buffer overflow vulnerabilities have been the most common problem for the past 10 years. Another reason is that these vulnerabilities offer attackers very effective methods of breaking into systems. The reason for people to be interested in these design tricks are to add the number of possible exploitations, to get around mismanaged bounce checks, and as I already mentioned, to as a side effect or as a bonus, to evade some sorts of both network-based intrusion detection systems and host-based ones too, as I'm going to show you now. I'm going to try to follow this agenda, where I will start with some theory, and then I go into the details of an example implementation that you find on your CD. And then I will finish by discussing a little bit about the possible countermeasures, to counter attacks based on these design tricks. For those of you that might want a brief reminder of the general concept of a stack overflow, I have made a simple illustration, the first graphical animation. This is the stack, and when a function is being called, the return address is stored on the stack, and then when the called function starts to execute, it gets a buffer of reserved memory for its internal variables, local variables, and so on. Welcome, you too. And then when this called function excuse me, is writing, if this call function is writing data to these local variables that are writing data to these local variables without doing any verification of the sizes, it might be possible for an attacker to write outside of the reserved buffer, and then the attacker might be able to overwrite the stored return address, and then it will look like this. So when the called function is finished and wants to return, it will use the stored, what it believes to be the stored return address, and return to somewhere, to some address in memory that the attacker has overwritten. And as a simple example, the attacker might want to supply an address that takes the program execution into the buffer he just supplied, like this. Okay, so I said if data is being written to these any of these local variables or this buffer without any of the sizes being verified, then it might be possible for an attacker to write outside of the reserved memory buffer and overwrite the return address. But as awareness of this problem grows among programmers, more and more programmers, fortunately, start to try to verify the sizes of the different buffers, start to try to do bounce checks within the programs. But there is still plenty of room for mistakes to be made. Let's, for example, say that a server verifies or performs a bounce check while it receives data from a client, but not later on when it's executing. Or let's say the programmers use string copy function, but that they have made a miscalculation of the number of bytes and so on. Then it might still be possible for an attacker to inject, and also as Halvar showed us yesterday in his excellent presentation, for those of you that saw it, there are plenty of more and really sophisticated ways for different attackers to get control of the execution. But let's say we have a situation where an attacker is able to make an injection to get control of the execution, although there might still be some kind of mismanaged bounce checks. Then this attacker will most probably have to deal with a set of size restrictions. If he's lucky, he have different buffers to play with for the injection, for taking control of the execution, and for his payload, for the instruction he wants to execute when he is in control. If the attacker is unlucky, then he might be forced to use the same buffer, and then most certainly the size restriction will apply to that entire buffer, both to the injector and payload. Then the attacker has two options. Maybe he can accept the size restrictions and try to do his thing using only the available number of bytes, and that's a little naive, but it's okay if it works. Otherwise, the attacker can take another approach and use another option and change his design concept and do something that I call a double injection, which I'm going to present in detail to you here and now. But first, let's say if the attacker chooses the first simple naive way of just using the available number of bytes in some buffer with some size restriction, then you got to keep the number of libraries low, gonna mind the number of functions calls, and just plain and simple try to keep his code as small as possible. We did some research on this a year ago while trying to proof a concept and exploit a particular server application. And we came up with a solution that we then thought was pretty small, using 250 bytes for some kind of simple, small, remote shell. We used WinSock and kernel 32 libraries. We used the datagram socket, and we basically did a loop over a receive from call and a call to WinExec in kernel 32. This is available on the Security Focus website, and you have the address on your hard copies and on this slide, if you want to have a look at it. As I said, that was a little naive, but it did the work. So it's okay. A better approach, a better design would be to use a double injection. And with by a double injection, I mean that the attacker uses his first payload to upload a second payload and execute it. This will have two benefits for the attacker. He's able to write a very small payload, just 40 bytes instead of 250 or even more. And the second benefit of having no size restrictions almost on the second part of the payload. To illustrate this, I have tried to make another fabulous animation with colors and arrows and stuff. And it works like this. The client connects to the server and sends a message to the server. The server receives it, maybe performs a bounce check, and calls an internal function in a library. Then this internal function performs a string copy operation, which happens to be fatal for the execution, and the attacker gets control. Then when the attacker is in control, when the attacker is executing within his first payload, the first payload does another call to the receive function and receive its second part, which it stores higher up in free memory somewhere, and then finish by jumping up to the second part of the payload. So that's basically the concept, an illustration of the concept of a double injection, which I'm going to go into the details of the code later. What the attacker can send, or what the attacker wants to send the second time, could be anything. And more on, the attacker does not need to mind doing XOR protection of null bytes, the second time because he's sending raw data over socket, and the XOR protection is for string copy. In the proof of concept implementation that I have given you, the second payload is only confirming its success by sending a small message back to the client. It's not doing any really fancy shell stuff or anything, but it proves the concept. So this seems nice, I hope. But how can the attacker do to minimize the code needed for the first payload? Well, there are at least two things the attacker can do. He can reuse the jump table of the vulnerable server application, and he can reuse the socket descriptor. And the socket descriptor represents the existing network connection, of course. To reuse the socket descriptor, he has to find it. And to find the socket descriptor, an attacker can put a breakpoint in on the accept call in the server application and look what happens when the accept call returns, because the return value from the accept call is a socket descriptor, and it's stored somewhere, probably on the stack frame of the main function of the main function in this case. To find to find the address of where to set the breakpoint, the attacker can do a disassembly of the server application, and there's lots of freeware disassemblers on the internet, and there's also a very good disassembler from Data Rescue called Interactive Disassembler, which I suppose most of you are using frequently. I have a detailed example of how to of what this might look like in the disassembly on actually on slide 38, although the slides aren't numbered. Well, it comes up later. Okay, so by reusing the jump table, the attacker gets the benefit of fewer bytes, and by using the same network connection and the socket descriptor, the attacker gets the benefit of evading those network-based intrusion detection system that looks for new TCP handshakes or elite XOR ports over the network. But there's even more benefits. If the attacker succeeds in writing a very minimal injector first payload, then the stack frame below is not going to be disrupted, and it might be possible for the attacker to perform a clean return when he has finished doing his things. And if he succeeds to do a clean return, it will have another benefit, namely it will evade those host-based intrusion detection systems too, that are looking for suspicious log entries like access violation or unsuspected termination of process or something like that. Okay, those of you that really paid attention on the last slide noticed that I said might be possible, because there are at least two more conditions that has to be met in order for the attacker to be able to do a clean return, like I said. First, the attacker got to find the correct return address, and then the attacker also might need to restore some internal register values, like the state of the function called before. So there are two conditions, at least two conditions. The first condition of finding the correct return address, that's because of the original return address is overwritten. That's how the attacker gets control in the first place. And there's two options again for the attacker to handle this, to meet this first condition requirement. Maybe he can calculate the return address manually, which I'm going to show you later, or maybe he can cheat and pop another stack frame. If he chooses to cheat, then he can pop another stack frame and return to another function. Let's say we have three functions. We have a main function which calls a first function in the library, and then this first function calls a second function in the library. Maybe the attacker, if there is a if the second function is the one that is being exploited, maybe the attacker, when he has finished, can return back to the not the first function, but the main function, then he's cheating in some sense. I made an illustration of this too, of course. Here's the first function call, here's the second, here's the overrun. And when the attacker has finished, maybe you can use this return address. Just pop another stack frame and return back to main. Oh, I'm sorry. Funny noise. Otherwise, if the attacker doesn't want to cheat, but do want to calculate the very correct return address, he can follow the execution path reverse manually. But because if you look at the stack memory, so below the stack frame of the first function in my example, the attacker will find the return address back to the main function. And a fixed distance from there is a fixed distance from that address is the call address into function number 1, and a fixed address down the library address from function number 1 is the call to function number 2. What did I just say? Did anyone get it? Did all of you get it, maybe? For those of you that might not have got it right away, let's have a look at function calls. They look like this. Let's say main wants to call a function in a dynamically loaded library. Then we have a call instruction followed by a jump instruction into the DLL. And the reason why they look like this is for the operating system to only need to patch one place in the code and not every call, and also so that the operating system does not need to know how to generate complete valid jump instructions, but rather patching a simple address into the code. So now I'm going to try and illustrate what I just said 3 slides ago in a better way. Just below stack frame number 1, which is marked in red, we have the return address back to where the program would return into the main function when it has finished. And a fixed distance down the code segment in the main function is the jump table, which the operating system has patched for the correct address to where the dynamically loaded library is currently being placed. And this address, of course, points into the function number 1 in the library, in the DLL. And then a fixed distance down from the entry point in the DLL of function number 1 is the call to function number 2 in my example. And this fixed distance plus 4 is the desired return address for a clean return back to function number 1. Now everyone got it, right? Beautiful colors and everything. Okay, so if you remember, I said there were 2 conditions that the attacker had to meet in order to be able to do a clean return. Well, we have taken care of, at least theoretically, the first condition, how to find or calculate the correct return address. And now we have the second condition or requirement that needs to be taken care of in order to do a clean return. Namely, the attacker might need to restore some internal register values. Because normally when function 1 calls function 2 and function 2 starts to execute, it saves the value of some internal registers which function 2 is going to use. And then in a normal situation, when function 2 is about to finish, it will restore this state or restore these values of these internal registers. But when the attacker gains control, thanks to the overwrite, he overwrites both all of the internal register value, the stored values, and of course the return address. And it looks like this. this is an illustration of the stack. And when the attacker overwrites, he will overwrite both the values of the internal registers and the return address to get control. But then he'll get to the problem of restoring the state in order to do a clean return, the second condition. And this might be tricky, and this will definitely differ and depend on the particular function, the particular application that you or someone else is trying to exploit. And from the attacker's point of view, if he can do a normal trace to a normal execution and do a proper debugging, he can deduce which of the internal registers that he will have to restore properly in order to do a clean return. And then he will have a different challenge every time or a different challenge for every application. To maybe predict these values, maybe they are static, or maybe they are possible to calculate from other information that is untouched. Okay, so I hope this sounds cool now, and I have provided a proof of concept implementation of a server and client with the full source code, of course, which is included on your CD, or I believe it's to be included on your CD, although I didn't get a CD myself. Otherwise, it will of course be available on the Black Hat website afterwards. Have anyone looked on the CD? Are the examples great? So you can have a look at them. I've also tried to make good comments in code about what I do. Okay, so the server I have implemented has the functionality of accepting connections, commands, some simulated commands or something from the client, and then responding in two different ways. And the server performs a bounce check while it receives data from the client, but not later on when it's doing actually it performs bounce check, but I have made purposely a miscalculation using string copy. The server, when it receives a connection, receives a command from the client, it calls an internal function called parse and execute in a dynamically loaded library called parse and execute DLL. And then this parse and execute function calls another function called internal, which contains the Stack Overflow vulnerability, just as I have already given this example of two function calls. Yeah. In this, in the example, I as the attacker gain control by overwriting the instruction pointer in such a way that it points to a return instruction in the main server application code. I use a null terminated injector, as you can see the address there. By doing a double return like this, the program will jump to the address which is just below where the stack pointer points when the function internal believes it is finished. And this has the effect of getting execution into the first buffer, which happens to be the argument to the function internal. Okay. In my implementation, the first payload performs these tasks. It finds the socket descriptor. It finds the address in the jump table of the receive function that the server uses. It performs a call to the receive function, and it stores a second payload somewhere in free memory, just a bit higher up on the stack. And then it jumps to the second payload, which it had just received. And here's some code. To find the socket descriptor, I had to debug the server application and look for the accept call and put a breakpoint here. And then when the server has performed the accept call and the breakpoint triggers, I look where the result from the accept call is being stored. And this happens to be a fixed distance from the base pointer, the base of the stack frame. Then this is important. When the client exploits this server, it has no idea of where in memory the stack frames are being placed. Their memory address might change. You don't know where the stack frames are in memory, but you do know, as you could see on the last slide, the socket's position within the stack frame. So the attacker does not need to know where the stack frame is, as long as he knows where in the stack frame the socket descriptor is being stored. And this is always on a fixed distance from the base. This is explaining the last slide. Maybe I should switch order. The socket descriptor in my example happens to always be placed 32 bytes away from where the stack pointer points to just after the attacker has gained control. And 32 bytes decimal is 20 bytes hex. And the stack pointer happens to point 1 byte down the stack frame of parse and execute function. In the code the assembly code of the first payload, it looks like this. I move the stack pointer to the base pointer, and then I reference the socket descriptor with a fixed distance, 20 hexes, 32 decimal from the base. Okay, so now by doing that, the first payload has found the socket descriptor. Okay. And then the first payload wants to reuse the jump table of the server application, and it happens to look like this. The receive function is down here, and this is the address to use. Okay, and then I made another fabulous animation of what the first payload does when it gets in control. It moves the base and stack pointer a little bit, then it starts pushing the arguments for the receive call onto its stack. The flags, the length of the buffer, a pointer to the buffer where the first payload will store the second payload. And I just happen to show this location. And then, of course, a reference to the socket descriptor, or the socket descriptor itself. And then the first payload performs the receive call and stores the second payload where the buff argument points, and then it jumps up there and continues to execute the second payload. The second payload I have provided in my example is sending a short message back to the client just to confirm that it is executing, and to confirm that it can still use the same socket descriptor and still use the jump table. Then the second payload calculates the correct return address back to the first function of 3, the one I call the parse and execute function. Restores all the necessary internal register, all the values of the necessary internal registers, and performs a clean return, just to proof of concept. And then the server, it works just like usual. You can connect to it again with netcat and send real commands. To reuse the jump table again, the second payload has to find the send function, and it happens to be down here, and the address to use happens to be this one. And it looks like this. And I'm still using, the second payload is still using the same socket, and it's using it by referencing it in this way, the same way as before. And then the second payload calculates the return address again, as I have said, by following the execution path backwards manually. And it looks like this, pretty similar to example I have already given. The second payload looks just below stack frame number 1 for the address back into the main function. It looks a fixed distance away from there for the address into the entry point of the parse and execute function. And then, so basically it's using these two offset values, fixed offset values. And they don't depend in any way on where the parse and execute library has been placed currently. But this is the second payload is also dynamic in this manner. And this is, of course, the correct return address, the desired return address that the attacker wants to use to be able to do this clean return. And the code for this looks like this. Here I have the fix offset in the main function and the fix offset in the parse and execute library. To restore the internal registers, I happen to know that the stack pointer shall point to the top of the stack frame and the base pointer shall point to the base of the stack frame. I have, and of course the size, just as before, I don't know and I don't need to know at what address the stack frame is being placed. But I know that the size of the stack frame will, in this example, always be the same, so I can just add the value. And then the register EBX. If you do a debug of the server application in a normal situation, you see that the register EBX shall point to a specific variable within the stack frame. And again, it doesn't matter where the stack frame is. You just need to know the fixed distance from either the top or the bottom of the stack frame, and just add it to get the address of where EBX should point in order to be able to do this clean return. And it looks like this in the code. Okay, so basically those were the design tricks that I'm suggesting. And to give you a summary the last couple of minutes, and I will give you a summary the last couple of minutes. I suggest a design trick that I call double injection, where I let the first injector and payload upload the second one. And I also suggest a design trick where an attacker tried to use and reuse an existing network connection by finding and reusing the socket descriptor, and also I suggest a design trick of reusing the jump table. It should be a little more to the left there, actually, on the slide. The benefits of doing like this is that an exploit implemented with these design tricks in mind will evade those network-based intrusion detection system that looks for unrecognized elite ports over the network, and it will evade those intrusion detection mechanisms that will look for new TCP three-step handshakes, and it will also evade those host-based intrusion detection system that maybe looks for new connections, or maybe looks for suspicious log entries of access violation, for example, because the clean return doesn't generate any crash. Okay, so now I'm going to. Now I have done the theory part and the implementation example dissection, and now I'm going to finish by mentioning a few words about the possible countermeasures. From a network-based intrusion detection systems point of view, it might be an exploit with these design tricks in mind might be countered by having the network-based intrusion detection system to interpret the actual application protocol that the client and server are supposed to use. And then, of course, a countermeasure would be for the attacker to make the communication of the first and second payload to use fake headers according to this specific application protocol. Or maybe if application protocol interpretation means checking whether or not the data being sent is binary data or ASCII data, maybe it's a good enough countermeasure for an attacker to use ASCII encoding. Also, it's important to think a little bit about complexity, because application protocol interpretation will probably add to the complexity of the intrusion detection system, and also session encryption might make it hard to implement this. Another thing besides protocol interpretation is for the network-based intrusion detection system to perform pattern matching of attack signatures, of course, and of course this will always work as a countermeasure as long as the attack signatures are valid for the particular exploit that the particular attacker is using at the particular time. For host-based IDSs, you could add some kind of strange behavior awareness functionality, and for example, an attack session might be statistically longer than a normal session, but again, strange behavior awareness will definitely add to the complexity requirements of a host-based IDS. So it will probably not be very easy. Other countermeasures besides specific IDS countermeasures is, for example, to prohibit execution on the stack, because in what I'm doing here is executing code, executing instructions on the stack, and you can simply provide prohibit execution there, and you can prohibit execution everywhere in memory besides of the proper place. Another possible countermeasure could be to put a reverse application proxy in front of the server and let the reverse application proxy perform like sanity checks of every request and response that are going between the server and different clients. But then you also have to be aware of the possibility that there might be vulnerabilities within this application proxy, and this is a very real very real threat, because we have seen very large vendors marketing reverse proxies with problems in themselves, so they added problem to the solution rather than fixing them. Okay, so basically I'm finished right now, and actually I got 3 minutes left, so if any one of you have any questions, please feel free to ask me now or just afterwards, or well, initially I was scheduled to speak yesterday, so catch us during the conference. Well, the conference will go on for 20 more minutes, so, but we'll still be here until tomorrow. And as I have written, you can of course always send us email. Yeah. So if you don't have any questions, yeah. I'm not sure I got that. Yes, I'm using a number of fixed offsets that comes from the specific server application that I'm exploiting. So this the exploits in the proof of concept implementation will of course always only work with this specific with the specific server I have provided. And the specific version of the server, but I don't think I will write another version of that one. Did I answer your question, or? Yeah, I did. Okay, thanks. Okay, thank you everyone very much.